When a hunter steps into the woods holding a high-powered rifle, they assume total control over their surroundings. They feel like the top of the food chain. Wrapped in camouflage and equipped with modern optics, we convince ourselves we have conquered nature. That gear creates a psychological shield, making us forget the ancient, brutal logic of the deep forest. But if you walk far enough from the trailhead, you cross an invisible threshold. Cell service drops, the sounds of the highway fade. You enter a state of extreme isolation, where the rules of civilization evaporate, and emergency help simply does not exist. To understand how vulnerability works out here, look at this spatial model. We call it the shrinking perimeter. Out in the wild, terror is defined by distance. It operates in 3 closing rings: observation, intrusion, and infiltration. True horror in the backcountry rarely begins with a sudden, violent ambush. It starts with a slow, methodical realization that an unseen entity is actively dismantling your buffer zone. In late 2021, a young bow hunter set up on a familiar 70-acre parcel of private land in northern Pennsylvania. He had hunted this thick timber multiple times and felt entirely at ease in the dark. About an hour after sunrise, he noticed a spatial anomaly. 60 yards away sat an old, weathered ladder stand that hadn't been there the week before. In the fresh snow, there was only one set of footprints leading straight from the deep woods to the base of that tree. At 8 a.m., the observer revealed himself. Standing perfectly still behind a nearby trunk was a pale, unkempt man in a dirty gray hoodie. He offered a slow, deliberate point in the hunter's direction, flashing a strange, half-hidden smile. The hunter climbed down hours later and found his own backpack, which he had left strapped to his tree stand earlier that morning. His knife, flashlight, and extra arrows were lined up neatly in the snow. The observer had quietly breached his immediate space while his back was turned. On the sprint back to his truck, the hunter found his escape route marked. The man had suspended the mutilated bodies of squirrels, a rabbit, and a crow from branches by wire, hanging them directly over rough circles drawn in the snow. That deliberate arrangement of dead animals and stolen gear shatters the apex predator illusion. The man with the bow had been watched and cataloged by someone who saw him as the prey. When the spatial buffer collapses, humans instinctively retreat behind physical boundaries. For a grandfather and grandson in Crockett, Texas, that safe house was a sturdy, remote family cabin built decades ago. After a successful morning hunt, they returned from town to find their harvested deer hanging near the cabin. It was covered in deep, aggressive claw and bite marks that defied the typical feeding patterns of local scavengers. Hoping to scare off whatever ruined their game, they ventured out that night with rifles. Instead of finding coyotes, the pitch-black tree line erupted with a deafening, non-human screech that neither man could identify. This map shows a perimeter collapsing. Heavy footsteps traced a direct line from the woods, forcing them to sprint back. They locked the cabin door, but violent slamming against the frame forced the grandfather to fire rounds straight through the wood to break the assault. Wood and iron offer a temporary delay, not true protection. When an apex wilderness predator decides to cross the threshold of safety, structural walls shift from being a shield to a trap. The weakest layer of defense a human can construct is a nylon camping tent. It provides no physical protection, relying entirely on the hope that whatever is outside chooses to leave it alone. 3 friends set up camp deep in the mountains for a weekend hunt. On the first night, a scream echoed through the timber. It sounded exactly like a woman being violently attacked, weaponizing their basic human empathy to try and lure them into the dark. Look at this campsite diagram. Over 2 nights, that sound migrated. It started miles away, easily dismissed as a fox. By the second night, the scream advanced, jumping across the topography until ringing out just yards beyond their firelight. They extinguished the fire and hid in their tents. Moments later, fast, heavy footsteps rushed directly into the campsite. One man lay paralyzed as something brushed right against his tent, deliberately dragging an object along the thin fabric as it moved past. In the dead silence that followed, that same horrific, wailing scream erupted from directly inside the center of the camp. The final spatial buffer had completely dissolved.
At zero distance, a loaded rifle offers no comfort. The hunters were reduced to a state where their tools were useless, at the mercy of whatever was pacing outside their thin nylon walls. Every survivor from these encounters walked out of the woods with a permanent loss of security. They abandoned those leases and stopped hunting alone, unable to shake the feeling of being vulnerable. For the men in the mountains, physical survival came with a paralyzing moral ambiguity. To this day, the narrator suffers from intense night sweats, entirely unsure if they successfully hid from a monster or if they sat trembling in their sleeping bags and ignored a dying woman. These encounters leave a cold, enduring truth. Humans, regardless of their technology or firepower, are only ever temporary guests in the deep wilderness. Our presence in the deep wilderness is precarious and temporary. The transition from apex predator to helpless prey requires nothing more than a single snapped twig in the dark.